I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're having our first drive of the brand new second generation C8 Audi A7. The A7 really is the brand leader within Audi's range. I think it's their most expressive looking car, and I reckon the first A7, which debuted 8 years ago now, is still one of the best looking Audis ever made. Thankfully, the second generation version of the car doesn't drop that ball. This is still a really cool looking, large executive liftback. It isn't a traditional sedan. In fact, it's the antithesis of a three-box design, instead keeping the first car's really cool boat tail rear end. Now, the A7 is coming to Australia effectively in two waves. Initially, you'll be able to buy the new 55 TFSI model, which is a 250 kilowatt petrol V6. Later on, a V6 diesel, and also a 180 kilowatt four-cylinder turbo petrol will follow. But at the moment, the 250 kilowatt version is all that you're able to buy. Now, the A7 is also part of a trio of new products: the already arrived A8, which is Audi's flagship, the soon-to-come A6 luxury midsizer, and this A7 slots in between. So we'll start exploring that by jumping inside. The interior of the A7 continues many of the design cues that we've already seen in the new A8. This is the next interpretation of Audi's new cabin design language, and there's some pretty big differences over the ways that Audi's used to look inside, including the previous A7. The MMI screen that used to fold up from the center of the dash has been moved into a more conventional appearance, running through this black strip in the cabin. And in fact, we've spent some time on the launch of the new A7 chatting to the designer of this car, who tells us that the theme going forward with Audi cabins will be that the blacked out pieces are actually where the driver and passengers can interact with technology, hence why this new large MMI screen is in this broad piano black piece here. But it's joined by a second touchscreen down below where you control functions like the climate control and switching off things like the lane keep assist and the auto start stop. Naturally, Audi's virtual cockpit hasn't gone anywhere. It's still between you and the road, offering a really large, crisp color screen. Now, a great thing is that the A7 shares many of the premium appointments with the flagship A8. The cabin doesn't just look like the A8's, it also feels much like it. Same lovely soft steering wheel, same highest grade Valcona leather on the seats, which is available in a variety of colors. This color here is the Rotor Grey, which I actually think is quite a nice alternative to black on black. There's also really nice metal aspects through the cabin. It all feels pretty luxurious. Storage is good too. Big cup holders between the seats, decent sized door bins. All in all, plenty of places to stash everyday clutter. One of the best design aspects of the outgoing first gen A7 that's been retained is the stunning frameless doors, which I think really adds to the premium effect of this car. Naturally, there's a reassuring thunk when you close that door, and after you've done that, what's the space like back here? Well, it's definitely sufficient for having adults in the back, if not generous, but for that, Audi's got the A8 flagship, and also the A6, the forthcoming sedan and wagon, will have more conventional rooflines. As you can see, for 6-footers, there's just enough headroom in the back of this car. That said, legroom's good, tow room is okay. You'd be able to fit two friends back here on the way to the golf club, for example, without too much of an issue. The Premium Plus package also adds 4-zone climate control for the rear seats here, which is nice. And you have amenities like a fold-down center console with additional storage and also cup holders in it, which is always nice to have. The other thing is, despite the sloping coupe roofline of this car, the back windows aren't actually pinched too much. The view out of the back of the A7 actually isn't bad. So, what's the new Audi A7 like to drive? Well, I don't think it'll surprise you that it feels quite a bit like a smaller, more lithe, more agile version of that A8 that we drove together recently. Naturally, the A8 feels like a really big car, because it is. The A7 is still generously long, however, it's meaningfully shorter than the A8, particularly because we were actually driving the A8L. Naturally, the A7 is a short wheelbase car based on the A8 short wheelbase. That said, it is longer, more stylish, certainly more of a statement than the conventional A6, which will come along next year. Essentially, the feeling that you get from the Audi A7 is that it's a very sophisticated, very comfortable premium vehicle. Interestingly, it can actually stand up to dynamic driving, which I'll come to in a moment, but I think for most people, you buy an A7 to effectively waft along in, and with those kinds of duties, this car is very, very capable. Keeping the dampers in their auto setting I found was a really relaxing way to drive this car. Comfort mode is perhaps a little bit too soft for Australian roads, which tend to be very sort of varying in quality. Auto seems to read the surface pretty well. The cabin is also extremely quiet and well insulated. The seats are very comfortable, the view out is good, and the fact that you've got all the technology in the right place really helps. Now, what kind of engine lineup do they have coming? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the 55 TFSI is the only variant of the A7 available at launch. That's a 3-litre turbocharged petrol V6 producing 250 kilowatts of power and 500 newton meters of torque, so certainly sufficient outputs. Certainly later on, performance versions of the Audi A7 will be coming, but until then, you wouldn't feel shortchanged buying the top grade petrol. Following later on in 2019 will be a 50 TDI, a 3-litre turbo diesel V6 with 210 kilowatts of power and 600 newton meters of torque, and also a 45 TFSI, which is a turbo 4 petrol making 180 kilowatts of power and 370 newton meters of torque. Now, all three of those engines have quattro as standard, which is really great on a big car like this. And interestingly, the A7 also benefits from the tuning of quattro over the years, in that Audis are now more engaging, more interesting to drive, and less one-dimensional. We found up here on the fast roads west of Brisbane, on Mount Nebo and Mount Glorious, if you know those roads, that the A7 was actually remarkably fun to drive, especially when you put the dampers, the steering into dynamic mode, which tightens everything up. Yes, the ride on the 21-inch wheels is a little bit sharp if you let one of them fall into a typical Australian pothole, but most of the time the air suspension does a good job of evening everything out. But the steering in the A7 is nice and light, particularly if you use the individual settings to keep that light while firming up the dampers. The front end is fairly sharp, the turn-in's quick, and interestingly, what I found is, at least if you have the Bridgestone Turanza tyres that were on about half of the vehicles on this launch, the rear end is quite playful and entertaining. Jump on the brakes and turn in quite assertively, and you'll find that the rear end will happily float around behind you in the corner, giving a sense of lift-off oversteer in this car. Jump back on the throttle with quattro, and of course everything just grips and goes. Fuel economy, we'll have to wait till we get back to Sydney for a detailed evaluation, but Audi tell us it will hover in the mid-7 range combined. A final interesting note initially about the A7 is that the V6 models use a 48-volt mild hybrid electric system, which now allows the vehicle to enter coast mode, so it's not using fuel effectively while you're not on the throttle and simply coasting on the flat or a shallow downhill section. Of course, that's going to save fuel, and the engine can also shut down for start-stop now from 22 kilometers per hour. So there's a few little things there that Audi are building in over time to boost the efficiency of combustion engines. Naturally, electric Audis are very, very close on the horizon, but until that point, there's plenty of assistance that electricity is able to give to combustion Audis that are launching, including this A7. Finally, impressively, is that the adaptive safety package is standard on these A7s that are delivered in Australia, so there's no more safety optioning that has to be done. AEB, adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, front cross traffic alert, all of that is standard on this car. So those are my initial impressions of the Audi A7. The range is limited at first by the presence of just one model, and it will be an even longer wait for real high-performance versions in the S7 and RS7, but as a starting point, the 55 TFSI is a really nice powertrain. Overall, this is a really likeable car on a first drive. I'm still not completely sold on the new fully touch-driven MMI inside, but everything you do touch feels expensive. The dynamics are very nicely sorted, and the refinement is massive in the new A7. I'm looking forward to driving it back on my own roads in Sydney to keep exploring this car.